In 1912, Russia supported the Balkan League of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro against the Ottoman Empire. Russia was greatly influenced by the nationalistic force of pan-Slavism, that there was a struggle to unite the southern Slavs, most of whom, though not all, were Orthodox Christians like Russia, and who shared a common mortal enemy in the Ottomans. The League's victory stripped the Ottomans of most of their European territories. However, the Second Balkan War, only a year later, exposed the fragility of Russia's strategy. Bulgaria, who was initially Russia's preferred ally, attacked Serbia and Greece over disputes about Macedonia's division, expecting Russian backing. Russia, however, wary of cutting off Serbia, did not intervene decisively to support Bulgaria. This non-intervention led to Bulgaria's defeat by Serbia, Greece, Romania, and the Ottomans. As a result, Bulgaria drifted toward allegiance to Germany and Austria-Hungary, which weakened Russia's influence in the Balkans. Serbia took the seat as Russia's primary, reliable Balkan ally, but its position alarmed Austria-Hungary and, of course, Bulgaria, leaving the Balkan Peninsula cut along two distinct lines. Russia's failure to mediate effectively in the Second Balkan War damaged its prestige, and when combined with the failures in 1905 in both the Russo-Japanese War and the Bloody Sunday Revolt, Tsar Nicholas II of the Russian Empire found himself poised to decisively exert Russian influence over the Balkans in whatever conflict next erupted, in order to protect both Russian prestige and his own behind. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb linked to the Black Hand Society, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914, designed to be unacceptable to the Serbian government. Contrary to their expectations, Serbia actually accepted almost all of the clauses of the ultimatum, which made the German Kaiser particularly happy because he saw it as a signal that war would not break out. But the Austrians saw it differently. Austria-Hungary mobilized for war against Serbia. Tsar Nicholas II thus faced intense pressure to directly support Serbia, even though the two countries had no actual binding treaty which compelled Russia to do so. Nonetheless, failure to do so would mean abandoning Russia's last major Balkan ally, destroying its influence, making the army look really weak on the world stage after the war with Japan, and leaving the very pro-Serbia parliament and public unhappy. Even still, Nicholas initially sought peace, engaging in the Willy-Niki telegrams to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, his cousin, which I made a whole video about a long time ago that you can check out, though the animation quality isn't quite up to par as some of my newer videos. Regardless, both the Kaiser and Tsar seemed to want to avoid war at first. However, Russia's partial mobilization on July 29th aimed at deterring Austria-Hungary escalated the tensions with Germany, who was bound by the blank check to fight alongside Austria in a defensive war, and when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th, Russia's full mobilization on July 30th triggered Germany's mobilization and then the Franco-Russian Entente, bringing France into the war, leading Germany to attack France through neutral Belgium, and triggering British entry. Then all the other dominoes fell and the world stumbled into the Great War. Russia mobilized faster than Germany expected, launching offensives into East Prussia and Galicia. The invasion of East Prussia, however, led to a devastating defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, wherein the Russian Second Army was encircled, losing 120,000 men. However, the Galician offensive against Austria-Hungary was more successful, capturing Lviv or Lemberg, and weakening Austro-Hungarian forces, causing Germany to shift troops from fighting France to fighting Russia. However, the 1915 Great Retreat came at a low point for Russia, as German and Austro-Hungarian forces pushed Russian forces out of Poland, Galicia, and even parts of Belarus. Russia suffered over 2 million casualties by year's end and lost a ton of territory. Russia, however, did manage to break back with the Brusilov offensive, which I also cover in a video of its own, which was Russia's most successful campaign in World War I, breaking Austro-Hungarian lines and capturing 400,000 prisoners. However, it was quite Pyrrhic, costing Russia nearly another million casualties, and soon food shortages, inflation, and military failures brought about the February Revolution, which forced Nicholas II to abdicate, ending the Romanov dynasty. The provisional government continued the war, but the release of Lenin into Russia by Germany and the October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power. Vladimir Lenin's communist government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, ceding massive territories in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics to Germany, which, on his part, he assumed would be reclaimed by the global communist revolution he had set in motion. And this effectively led to Russia's exit from the war in a period of intense and rapid change as the Soviet government was constructed. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Russia stayed neutral during the July crisis? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Roanoke, Subper, Stratocrat, Daniel Angelis, Alfonso Maurice, Sebastian, Atomical Mon Studios 2, PJ the Homeless Mage, Kennedy the V, Joseph, and Chance Bowman. Thank you, and enjoy the show. If we assume that, for whatever reason, Russia does not involve itself in defense of Serbia during the July crisis of 1914, the changes are quite immediate. We'll assume that Russia would issue some sort of public statement declaring neutrality, and refusing to mobilize its armies while Austria-Hungary still declares war on Serbia. Now, Russia, who was, again, the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, would abandon its role definitively with this second bout of neutrality in a Balkan conflict, leaving the various Orthodox and Slavic populations in the Balkans to fend for themselves. Without Russia's involvement, France then cannot justify involvement, and neither, of course, can Britain. Germany's involvement also hinges on whether the Austro-Serbian conflict, which thus far it is just an Austro-Serbian conflict, escalates beyond the Balkans. And of course, with Russia neutral, the immediate trigger for German mobilization, which was Russia's threat to Austria-Hungary, is now absent. Chancellor Bethmann Hallwig and the German staff are still likely to offer diplomatic backing and limited material aid to Austria-Hungary, but there will be no German mobilization. And this basically means that World War I doesn't happen. Instead, it's an Austro-Serbian conflict that emerges out of the July crisis. Serbia, now quite isolated without Russian support, is essentially put in the position of a lamb penned in for the slaughter, and the Black Hand assassins who killed Franz Ferdinand and sparked this conflict would likely now be quite depressed at Russia's inaction, which all but assures Serbia's defeat. The Serbian army, numbering around 230,000 men, was still significantly well experienced from the Balkan Wars, but vastly outnumbered and outgunned by Austria-Hungary's forces, which exceeded 400,000 in just that region. Serbia's strategy would probably mirror its historical approach, a defensive campaign using the terrain to their advantage and with guerrilla tactics. However, without Russian intervention to divert Austro-Hungarian resources eastward, Serbia's resistance is probably going to be short-lived. The psychological blow is equally devastating. Serbia's nationalist dream of a greater Serbia, uniting the South Slavs, or what would later become a Yugoslavia, is essentially dust in the wind. Morale would plummet fast as the Serbian government realizes that no great power will come to its aid, and their only hope would, at this point, lie in potential support from Montenegro, their small ally. But this much would be, of course, insufficient to alter the outcome. Montenegro had a 12,800-man army, and historically joined Serbia against Austria-Hungary right in the start in 1914. It would be logical to assume that without Russian involvement, King Nikola of Montenegro would be hesitant to join. However, Montenegro's loyalty to Serbia, a highly prevalent pro-Yugoslav sentiment in the country, a desire for national unification with Serbia, and Nikola I's autocratic and military-enforced rule would actually make neutrality unlikely. Further, the lack of a clear military doctrine in the country would make neutrality among the Montenegrin army unlikely, even if Nikola declared neutrality, which is odd but a consequence of the limited political organization of Montenegro during this time. So essentially, Montenegro will join the war. There is another thing to address, that being whether or not Bulgaria will still get involved in this war. After its defeat in the Second Balkan War, Bulgaria had, as you might assume, major grudges against Serbia and Greece for territorial losses in Macedonia and in Thrace. Historically, Bulgaria aligned with the Central Powers after Russia's failure to support it in the Second Balkan War in 1913. Of course, cozying up to Austria-Hungary. Tsar Ferdinand I would undoubtedly still join the war, probably even earlier, with the Treaty of Bucharest in short memory, and thus Bulgaria would attack Serbia from the south, hoping to regain Vardar Macedonia with a huge 450,000 strong army, which, like Serbia, was battle-tested from the Balkan Wars. And with this army, Bulgaria would actually majorly tip the scales decisively against Serbia from the south, ensuring the war would be swift and brutal. Other Balkan states like Greece and Romania are likely to stay neutral. Greece under Prime Minister Venizelos might sympathize with Serbia, but would fear Bulgarian retribution. And of course, Romania, having gained southern Dobruja from Bulgaria in 1913, has no pressing reason to intervene unless its borders are threatened, which they wouldn't be. The Ottomans would likewise not join, since Russia is neutral. Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria would then launch a coordinated assault on Serbia by late August 1914, with Austria-Hungary invading from the north and west, targeting Belgrade and the Drina River, while Bulgaria would strike from the southeast, aiming for Niš and Skopje? They made all the names really annoying just for me. By mid-1915, Austria-Hungary would probably be able to absorb Montenegro into its sphere of influence, and then Belgrade would fall and Serbia would be partitioned, with Austria-Hungary annexing Montenegro and northern Serbia, including Belgrade, while Bulgaria would take Macedonia and parts of eastern Serbia. The occupation would, just like the war, be quite brutal. Austria-Hungary would impose harsh measures to suppress Serbian nationalism, which is the force that killed Franz Ferdinand, and Bulgaria would pursue Bulgarization policies in Macedonia, expelling the Serbs. The conquest would, of course, strengthen Austria-Hungary's Balkan and Adriatic positions, but would cause huge Slavic unrest, undoubtedly, within the empire, particularly in Bosnia and in Croatia. Bulgaria's ambitions in Macedonia and Thrace would also put it on a collision course with Greece. In this timeline, Greece, of course, remained neutral in the war, lacking Russian or British support. However, Bulgaria's success against Serbia could easily embolden Tsar Ferdinand to press claims on Greek-held territories around Thessaloniki, territories that Bulgaria coveted after the Second Balkan War. By late 1915, it's not even out of the picture for Bulgaria to launch a limited offensive against Greece, targeting eastern Macedonia. There were already reports of border skirmishes occurring during this period, and whether real or not, both sides claimed the other's borders guards had shot at their citizens and soldiers. Eventually, war was likely to break out. Despite neutrality in the Austro-Serbian War, Greece maintained a mobilized army of approximately 125,000 men and a quite formidable navy, which dominated the Aegean Sea and dissuaded Ottoman conflict during this period. The war, we'll presume, would begin something like November 1915, with Bulgarian forces launching a surprise offensive across the border into Greek-held eastern Macedonia. Bulgaria might be able to deploy around 150,000 troops, but its resources would likely be strained by an ongoing occupation in, of course, those lands annexed just recently in Serbia, which it not only just conquered, but also had yet to consolidate. Greece would thus turn to fortify Thessaloniki and the Struma River Valley. The Greek army, though smaller, would be well entrenched and would benefit from superior naval control, which could actually disrupt Bulgarian supply lines along the Aegean coast. The initial Bulgarian advance could thus only capture small border towns, with Greek resistance in a battle, say at the Ceres, able to halt their momentum. Greek forces would just have better artillery and be supported by local ethnically Greek militias, and this resistance would either really slow Bulgaria down or force them to divert troops from their Serbian occupation zones. By early 1916, the front could thus stabilize along the Struma River, with Greece holding Thessaloniki and Kavela, but struggling to push back Bulgarian forces entrenched in the rugged Macedonian terrain. This little war would, ironically, not unlike certain fronts in the Great War of our own history, become a grueling attritional conflict, a taste of modern trench warfare on a small, localized scale. The war would also threaten Ottoman territories in Thrace, particularly Adrianople, which Bulgaria briefly held in 1913. The Young Turk regime, which took power that same year and was focused on internal reforms, not imperial expansion, would likely be forced out of necessity to remain neutral in this conflict, but might ironically enough lean towards supporting Greece to counterbalance Bulgaria's growing power. By early 1916, the Ottomans could even be suspected to provide covert support to Greece in arms shipments and intelligence, hoping to weaken Bulgaria and secure their Thracian border, and perhaps disrupt or at least stall Bulgarian shipping in the Aegean. Direct Ottoman intervention is unlikely, however, as this could provoke Austria-Hungary, or even Russia at this point. But Britain would be a different story. Britain saw Greece as a strategic bulwark against Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman influence in the Mediterranean, and furthermore, the upper classes of the Isles tended to be quite Hellenophilic, that is, having an interest or affinity in Greek culture or history. They were essentially the Hellenic version of a weeb. Regardless, in an effort to preserve the balance of power, the British Navy would likely increase its presence in the Aegean, ostensibly to protect trade routes, but effectively to deter Bulgarian or Ottoman naval operations, because the British, even if the Ottomans were covertly supporting the Greeks, wouldn't trust either. Britain would also warn Bulgaria against further escalation, and by mid-1916 we might expect Bulgaria's offensive to stall due to overstretched resources, as the Greek navy would completely be able to disrupt Bulgarian supply lines, sink merchant vessels, and blockade the Aegean coast with the tacit approval of the British and the Ottomans. On land, Greek forces would launch a counteroffensive in the late spring, pushing Bulgarian troops back to the Nestos River, and we would then likely see a battle of Kavela with Greek forces repelling a Bulgarian assault, decisively securing the city. However, Greece would lack the manpower for a full-scale invasion of Bulgaria, and Bulgaria's defensive positions in Macedonia would remain formidable. It's about this time when we can expect Britain to step in, with, later that year, Britain brokering talks between Greece and Bulgaria, with Austria-Hungary urging Bulgaria to negotiate so that it's not weakened and can remain a strong Balkan partner for the Austrians, and the British leveraging their economic influence to push for a resolution which would preserve Greek control over Thessaloniki. Under the creatively named Treaty of London, Greece would retain Thessaloniki and Kefala, however it would cede a strip of eastern Macedonia, including the town of Drama, to Bulgaria as a face-saving compromise for Tsar Ferdinand. This would effectively be a Greek win, though Bulgaria would gain some minor territories. The Bulgarian government would now face a legitimate domestic criticism for overreaching, but this would do nothing to topple Bulgaria's now very strong position in the Balkans, and their only improving relations with Austria-Hungary, in whom they both had a great common goal in suppressing Serb nationalism. So even despite their effective defeat, Bulgaria would remain quite strong. The treaty would still, though, leave Greece as the relative victor, bolstering Venizelos' domestic position, which is a good segue into their common neighbor by this point, Albania. Greece was occupying parts of Albania around this time, and the young Albanian state, legally under the rule of Prince Wilhelm of Wied, was actually essentially a lawless wildcard region with internal divisions among tribal leaders, religious factions, and regional warlords who controlled various swaths of territory in the country. Think Wild West Texas during the Civil War. Throughout the aforementioned war between Bulgaria and Greece, and even the Austro-Serbian War, everything would effectively be working to destabilize Albania further, as Serbian refugees and partisans from both conflicts would flee into northern Albania, crashing with those local forces, and causing some religious and ethnic tensions, as one does whenever a pebble is moved in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary, after defeating Serbia, would effectively exert influence over northern Albania with troops stationed on the border, and once war between Greece and Bulgaria breaks out, any factions in Albania who are pro one side or the other would end up fighting within Albanian territory. Albania could thus easily have become a proxy battleground during that war between Greece and Bulgaria, with Greece controlling southern regions and Bulgaria influencing the east, and Austria-Hungary, wary of losing influence in the north, likely trying to prop up Prince Wilhelm's regime with financial aid to use Albania as a neutral buffer between it and Greece. And thus the Austrians would likely try to persuade the Bulgarians to do the same to support Wilhelm's regime, though it is debatable as to whether or not they'd comply. In any case, the great powers, mostly just Britain, Austria, and Italy, would really want Albanian stability to prevent further escalation in the Balkans and the Adriatic. And thus, with the Treaty of London, I assume Albanian independence would also be reaffirmed, and maybe Greek forces evacuated from southern Albania, with the British and Austrians propping up Wilhelm's government with subsidies. Now, with the Balkans wrapped up in a nice ethnic cleansing bow, Russia's neutrality in 1914 would manage to preserve its homeland military and economic resources, avoiding, of course, all of the losses that came with entry into World War I and the collapse of the Tsarist regime and the Russian Civil War. However, neutrality comes with a lot of major trade-offs for Russia. Russia's industrial modernization was underway, but it would slow without the wartime urgency that drove historical reforms in favor of rapid industrial development. The Duma, or the parliament, which was dominated by pan-Slavists who supported Serbia, would accuse Tsar Nicholas of abandoning Slavic brethren in Serbia, which would then sow the seeds of dissent among the elite and segments of the populace who might consider themselves pro-Serbian. Diplomatically, Russia's neutrality would also isolate it from its Triple Entente partners of Britain and France, who, France in particular, and much less so Britain, would view Russia's inaction as a betrayal of their interests against Germany. This would strain more so the Franco-Russian alliance as opposed to Russian and Britain Little Entente, pushing Russia towards a more insular foreign policy, but it could also threaten their ties with the British, as Britain may now be emboldened to exert more diplomatic pressure in Persia and Afghanistan, the great game in Central Asia, which had previously ostensibly been paused with the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. Britain could easily see this as Russian inaction or inability and Russian weakness. And if Iran becomes once again a battleground for British and Russian influence, the British could easily find themselves expanding their control over southern Persia and the Persian Gulf, securing oil interests. And thus Iran would be forced to, geopolitically, tilt now toward Britain by default, as Russia would have less of an ability to project power. Now, internally, the lack of a unifying war effort would also exacerbate social tensions in Russia, with the peasants demanding land reform and the workers pushing for better conditions, and certain minority groups also agitating for autonomy now. We could thus see small-scale revolts across the Russian Empire. No unified revolution, but instability that would force Russia to consolidate. This would be a huge threat to Nicholas II's legitimacy. The Russian military would view neutrality as a cowardly retreat from Russia's role as protector of the Slavs, and some officers could even quietly align with nationalist factions in the Duma, weakening Nicholas's control over the army. And the cadets and the Octobrists would be emboldened to criticize Nicholas for failing to uphold Russia's great power status, and also the progressive bloc in the government would accuse him of weakness and call for even more constitutional reform, or perhaps even republicanism, a word which struck fear into every czarist. The Russian people would feel betrayed by the Tsar's refusal to aid Serbia. The urban populations would see Nicholas as detached, and even smaller powers like Romania and Greece could end up distancing themselves from Russian influence, seeking stronger patrons in Austria-Hungary or Britain as the Balkan League quietly dissipates into thin air. While there would be no full-scale revolution, we could see a constitutional crisis by the end of the decade. The Ottoman Empire, no longer threatened by Russian ambitions in the Black Sea, could also feel safe in implementing internal reforms. Japan might even be emboldened to make moves in Manchuria or Mongolia, perhaps with British support. Sweden might be pushed further to Germany economically. France could strengthen its Entente Cordiale with Britain, focusing on colonial cooperation and joint military preparedness without Russia in an effort to counterbalance Germany. And Germany itself would find itself basically a quiet victor by 1916, having avoided war altogether while strengthening its ally Austria-Hungary, and ostensibly creating a new one in a more powerful Bulgaria. The Kaiser will also probably be bold enough by this point to continue to escalate the naval arms race with Britain, as Germany seeks to challenge British maritime dominance in the North Sea. Without a general war, the pace of this race will eventually slow, but it will solidify Anglo-French cooperation above all else. Now, there is the obvious question of stability in some of these empires in the coming years. Without World War I, the Ottoman Empire would avoid the catastrophic losses that led to its historical collapse, and could feel safer in the Straits and the Caucasus, which would allow the Young Turk regime more time, again, I think I already mentioned this, to focus on internal reforms, centralizing authority, and modernizing the military. However, there are still those ethnic tensions with the Arabs, the Kurds, and the Armenians, which will keep the empire very fragile, and Britain will still be interested, likely in undermining Ottoman influence over the Mediterranean. They won't be able to directly support rebel forces like Hijaz or the Arabs like they had in World War I, but they could try to economically encircle the Turks, or at least exert some pressure on them during this period of internal consolidation in the Middle East. And the fact is, Arab nationalism, which was already stirred by the 1911 Italo-Turkish War and British encouragement, would still exist. Again, there won't necessarily be an Arab revolt, but Sharif Hussein of Mecca may, with British backing, negotiate greater autonomy for Hijaz, and the Arab tribes in the peninsula, not under Ottoman rule or influence, might find themselves organizing with greater efficiency. Cracks in the Ottoman Empire's authority would thus have begun, and Britain would be ready and eager to exploit them if Turkish rule broke down enough. There is also the question of stability in Austria-Hungary. As mentioned before, Austria-Hungary's victory over Serbia and Montenegro would strengthen its geopolitical position, but would not resolve its internal contradictions. The empire's multi-ethnic structure, with a government comprised of Germans, Hungarians, Bosnians, Croats, Romanians, Slovenians, some Italians, and even North Slavs like Bohemians or Czechs and Slovakians, and now also more Bosnians and Serbs and Montenegrins and others, would all be a powder keg of different religions, languages, ethnic, tribal, and nationalist sentiment, all with competing interests within the different crowns and territories. By 1917, Austria-Hungary would without a doubt face increased internal unrest. In Bosnia, in Vojvodina, in all sorts of areas where Serbian partisans would be a constant, unsuppressible force of rebellion, and other ethnic minorities would begin to consider their own interests above those of the dual monarchy. The Hungarian elite, in particular, who were particularly wary of Slavic empowerment because of their dominion over the Croats, would block any reforms from the Austrians to try and appease the Slavs, paralyzing the empire's governance and essentially gridlocking the parliaments. Now, without the military and logistical strain of a world war, Austria-Hungary would not immediately collapse, but it would enter essentially a slow decline. We can assume that Emperor Franz Joseph would die in 1916 as her own timeline, which would bring Charles I to the throne. Charles I, later known as Blessed Karl, but born Karl Franz Joseph Ludwig Hubert George Otto Maria, was a member of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. He was the grandnephew of Emperor Franz Joseph I and became the heir presumptive after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, his uncle, in 1914. Karl was a devout Catholic, a reform-minded monarch, and briefly served as emperor in our own history during the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire during World War I. Again, in our own history, he was known as the Peace Emperor for his attempts to end the war, but of course, in the end, he lost his throne as the empire disintegrated. Now, Karl, much like his uncle Ferdinand, believed the empire's survival depended on addressing the grievances of the ethnic groups. He supported a federalized structure and the transformation of Austria-Hungary into a confederation of autonomous states, an idea inspired by the United States of Greater Austria concept that Franz Ferdinand tended to support, which we discuss again in a different video on the topic. To keep things short, the United States of Greater Austria plan was interesting, but would not necessarily have been effective at keeping the empire together. But Karl might be a different story. As a career officer, Karl served in the Austro-Hungarian army, giving him insight into its strengths and weaknesses. His exposure to the empire's diversity in troops made him empathetic to these minority populations, and also very wary of the military structure of the empire, which he thought was incredibly disjointed, which it was, as was shown in World War I. His intelligent and politically astute wife, now Empress Zita, who was ethnically Italian, was also a significant influence on his life, encouraging his reformist agenda. And again, as a devout Catholic, Karl's politics were heavily shaped by Christian social principles, and especially, with the influence of his wife, charity. He wanted to improve conditions for workers and peasants and for the minorities in Austria-Hungary. With his short reign and our own history in mind, we might assume he would seek to reinstate the Austrian parliament, the Reichsrat, after ascending to the throne, inviting representatives from Czech, Polish, and Croatian and other ethnic groups to draft a federal constitution for the Austrian crown of Austria-Hungary, hoping to gain support from these ethnic minorities under the Austrian crown through parliamentarianism. But of course, the Hungarian elite, led by figures like István Tisza, fiercely resisted decentralization, as they wanted to pursue Magyarization, and didn't want to lose their privileged position of control over Croats, Slovaks, Serbs, and Romanians in the Kingdom of Hungary. This would effectively pit Vienna and Budapest against one another, which would come at an awful time for imperial stability. It's also without a doubt that Austria-Hungary would by this point be forced in certain regions to enforce martial law to suppress Serbian nationalism, as Austrian garrisons would be facing constant guerrilla attacks from partisans, particularly in the Šumadija region. Croat and Bosniak nationalists would likewise defend their autonomy, but Hungarian resistance and Austro-German conservatism would prevent Karl from doing anything about this. Soon, a constitutional crisis would hit. Protests would erupt in Prague and Zagreb. The empire would face a slow unraveling. By the mid-1920s, Austria-Hungary may even evolve into a loose confederation or fracture into semi-independent states, with Hungary potentially breaking away and Slavic regions aligning with Bulgaria or maybe Romania, or a resurgent Serbia should Yugoslavism still take hold. We might then see an Italo-Austrian conflict as Italy, seeking control over Istria and Dalmatia, would press claims on these Adriatic territories. Austria-Hungary's support for Albania's Wilhelm regime could also irritate Italy, who wanted influence in the Adriatic and over Albania. We could see something of an expedition similar to Gabriele D'Annunzio's Fiume escapade, which has Italian irredentists march in and occupy parts of Dalmatia, prompting Austrian naval retaliation, with Britain and France mediating to prevent a broader war. This could then see a treaty, brokered likely by Britain, granting Italy minor territorial concessions like Zara, but preserving Austrian control over most of Dalmatia. Germany would, by this point, also be in the market for new allies, perhaps courting the Ottoman Empire to secure access to Middle Eastern markets, oil, and to counter British influence in the Persian Gulf. A détente with Russia is possible as well, though highly improbable, as, though both share concerns about British expansionism, the Russians didn't trust the Germans, and the German General Staff likewise saw Russia as their second greatest threat behind France. Nonetheless, we could potentially see at least a German-Russian non-aggression pact, though nothing like a formal alliance. There is another interesting question which I'd like to go on a little tangent about, and that being America's trajectory. Without World War I, the US would continue its economic rise and its industrialization and urbanization without the boom and bust cycles the Great War created. The growth would be slower, particularly in industries like steel and munitions, but far more stable, avoiding a depression. The US would also remain a creditor nation, but without the same financial dominance it achieved with European war debts. America would thus focus on hemispheric influence, enforcing the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America and expanding trade in the Caribbean. The Panama Canal also, which was completed in 1914, would become a cornerstone of U.S. strategy and would likely allow the Americans to turn their attention to the Pacific and Pacific trade. America would still be staunchly isolationist, but American businesses would likely find it quite viable to invest in Asian markets in the Philippines and China, now essentially competing with Japan and Britain. European markets would be important, but US exports would now be facing stiffer competition from a non-belligerent Germany and Britain still on their industrial and economic trajectories. And thus, an American pivot to the Pacific is likely, if not ensured, in this alternate timeline, which is kind of funny. So as the mid-1920s dawn in this alternate world, beyond even just the tinderbox that would be the former Austro-Hungarian regions, the world would be bristling with different little pricks ready to precipitate a war. Bulgaria would silently be preparing to attack Greece again. Albania would find itself in a tug-of-war between Italian and Austrian influence. The Ottoman Empire would face what would likely evolve into an Arab rebellion lit in the Hejaz. Russia would be on the brink of collapse. Germany and Britain would be close to the apex of their naval rivalry, just waiting for an incident to ignite war. The United States would slowly begin to encroach on British and Japanese influence in the Pacific, likely clashing over Shanghai and tariffs. And the world would find itself perhaps not poised for a large-scale great power conflict, a modern war like World War I, but preparing for at least a series of incidents around the globe not easily dissipated. And on that cliffhanger is where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.